Hello, Tobacco County 4-H leather crafters. I know it's more fun when we get to meet in person and work on our projects together, but this year we're just going to make do. But I still wanted you guys to be involved in your leather craft projects. So this video is introduction to Unit 1 leather crafting, and if you should have all gotten your kits. If you're in Unit 1 and you didn't get a kit, then contact the extension office and I'll make sure we get one to you. But this video, we're going to take a look at the items that are in your kit. We're going to take a look at the tools and practice using the tools, because that's one of the main things that Leathercraft Unit 1 is about, is getting to know our 5 basic tools, learning how to stamp and stamp good impressions with them. And that's kind of the focus of it, and that's kind of what you'll be judged on. So we're going to do an introduction to that in this video. So if you have your kit with you, you can look at the contents of it. So of course you have a what we call a tooling surface, and this is made out of granite. So you have to have some kind of granite or marble. You will also have a mallet and a maul, and so these are the things that we tool with. We use them to make the impressions in our tool. So this one's the mallet, the one that looks like a hammer style. It's easy to get started with because it's familiar for you guys to use, and it has this flat surface. This is a maul. Kind of as you get started, a lot of kids like to use this instead of the mallet because it has a little more weight behind it and it helps with your impressions. You also have a water squirt bottle. Before we get started on tooling anything, no matter what project it is or unit that you're in, we have to do what is called casing the leather. And what that means is making the fibers that are in that the leather is made up of soft, so that you can use your tools to make a good impression of it. So when you hear me talk about casing your leather, or more commonly we'll say wet your leather, that's what that's referring to. This is called your tool block. It kind of helps keep your area nice and neat and keeps your tools wrangled up so that they're not spread out all over your surface. You can see that there's the holes for your tools to go in. And for Unit 1, you start with what we call the 5 basic tools. And so these are them, and close-up pictures of these are also in your project book. So keep that book with you when you're working on your projects, because it's a great reference. This is the pear shader because it's the shape of a pear. We have one that's kind of a small round circle. This tool is called the cedar tool. You have one that is called the camouflage tool, and it's kind of like a lot of kids say it looks like a seashell, or it looks like a crescent shape. That's the camouflage tool. You have one called the veiner tool. This kind of longer arc shaped tool is your veiner tool. And then we have what we call the background tool, which is actually pretty similar in shape to this pear shader, but a lot smaller, and that's called your background tool. So those are your 5 basic tools that we'll be working with. Next, inside of your kit, you're going to find your pieces of leather. So what we're going to do in videos for our Unit 1 is we'll get it set up so that you'll end up with 3 things that you can enter in the fair. There are more classes than that that you can enter things into. So if you look through your project book and you find another one that you want to make, go ahead and you can get those supplies and you can make them. But with what's in your kit, you'll come out with 3 things for entering in the fair. So first, you'll have 2 pieces like this. These are just our practice pieces that we're going to go through so that you have some leather that you can play with and practice stamping on your tools with. you'll have some coasters, 3 coasters. And so one coaster is kind of like a practice coaster to kind of learn making different designs and things like that with. And then you have 2 more coasters that you can try to make a more finished project with. And then you'll pick your favorite one, and that will be the one that you take to the fair. We also have the coin purse and some lace, and then you'll have a keychain. There was also some rectangle pieces. These are just more practice pieces. And then finally in here is the machine, which is what we put on our project towards the end or at the end. In Unit 1, you're only allowed to apply a clear finish, but what that does is it seals the leather. Okay, so I'm going to put these all back in here, except for my scrap piece of leather. So if you want to work along with me, I like to use them all, so I'm going to put my mallet back in here. And I'm going to leave out my 5 tools, my water bottle, and my maul. Okay? And so as you're going through stuff, when you're done using a tool, instead of leaving it set, keep it here in your tool block. It protects the tools, because I'm always telling kids, don't drop the tools. Don't let them roll off the table onto the floor, because it will break the tool and it no longer is any good to us after that. So take care of your tools, keep them in your block so that they're not rolling away, rolling off the table, and your work surface isn't messy. It's always organized. So the first thing we do is remember how I talked about casing the leather. So if you take your spray bottle, and what we do is we just want to spray our leather and get it nice and wet. We'll let it sit for just a few minutes, and we'll get started tooling. Okay, so now you have cased your leather, wet your leather, and you've let it sit to soak in that moisture now for several minutes. And the reason why it's important to let your leather sit instead of just wetting it and trying to tool on it right away is so that those fibers, one, they kind of absorb and soak in that moisture. Because if you try to tool on it when it's too wet, your impressions don't stay. As the fibers dry out, then those impressions will kind of lift to the surface. And by letting that moisture soak in and not having it too wet, those impressions will stay, and they'll create for us what we call a burnish in the leather. So now that you've let this sit to soak in for a while, if you put it against your cheek or against the back of your hand, you can feel that it's nice and cool, and that feeling kind of helps you to know that it's ready to start tooling on. So what we're going to do is just introduce ourselves to our tools and just practice hitting them so we understand what kind of impression we make. So the first tool I am going to start with is going to be our camouflage tool. So if you grab it first, when we hold it on our leather, we want to be holding it to start out with straight up and down, okay? As you get into it, we might work on angles, but for now, for what we want to do, we want to learn to make a good impression, so we're going to hold it straight up and down. I like using them all. If you would rather use the mallet, then that's your choice. Both are very suitable for starting out with. So I'm going to hit on the top of my tool just a few times to get a good solid impression. And so you can kind of experiment what it looks like if I hit it too light. You can see how you can see one much easier than the other one. So we're going for the more desirable versus the too light. You can also take your tool and, hit it what we would say might be too hard. And what happens then, especially if you get into some of your other tools like a cedar tool, you could find that you might go through the leather. So we don't want to go too deep either. Our goal is to look for that this medium, nice burnish look in our leather. So you can go ahead and practice and finding what that impression looks like for you. You might be also finding that if you're not holding your tool straight up and down, you might be putting more pressure backwards or more pressure forwards. And when you do something like that, you notice that you don't get a full impression. This is the one where I did where I was accidentally putting too much pressure backwards. So you see that I didn't get the tip of the crescent tool. Or if you're putting more pressure forward, then you see that I'm not getting the full shape on top either. And the same for leaning left and right. If I'm doing too much pressure one way or the other, you see how I don't get the full impression. So for us in Unit 1, one of our goals is getting that good impression. Okay, so if you put that tool back in your block, let's go ahead and move on next to what we call the pear shader. And we'll do the same thing, holding it straight up and down. And again, I just want you guys to get the look of what it looks like. So if you picture like an upside down pear. And doing the same thing, just go ahead and make yourself a row. Trying to make it your goal that each time you put your tool down, that you're holding it straight up and down. And the same when you're coming and hitting on top. So a lot of times if you're using the maul and you find yourself slipping off the top and not being able to get a good impression that way, then go ahead and try your mallet. This is my example of the tool slipping off of the top. So each time you put your tool down, your goal is to make sure that you're holding it straight up and down. You'll notice how I have my thumb on one side, and then I have all 4 fingers holding it in the back, and my pinky, you can see my pinky, it's the closest one down here at the bottom. And this is kind of what I'm using really to balance my tool on the leather. But I've got my 4 fingers in the back, my thumb in the front. I'm holding it with a steady hand. I'm holding it against the leather firmly. And the same with my tool. I don't want, or my maul. When I'm holding it firmly in my hand, and I'm trying to make a good contact between the top of the tool and my maul or my mallet. And that's what helps you make a good impression. So each time you're setting it down, try to make a good impression. And they should all look similar to each other. That's the other goal, is we want consistency. So these here would be pretty consistent. This one here is not. and then we get back again to pretty consistent. So if you are being judged on your work for the fair and you have a hair shade that's like this and like that and like that and like this and like that, there's not a lot of consistency here in this row versus these ones here. So each time you set it down, that should be your goal. Holding your tool upright, making good contact with your mallet or mallet, and hitting it with the same force that we provide consistency. Okay, we can put our pear shader up. And let's grab a hold of our veiner tool next. So this tool is your veiner tool. And it's the same thing. So you can see here, this one is hard to get consistent for a lot of kids because it's a bigger tool, a lot wider. So you can see clearly here, I had more pressure on this side than on this side. So I need to work on that so that I have the same consistency, that I'm holding it with the same pressure throughout. So I'll try again. I'll check and make sure I'm holding it straight up and down. Check to make sure I'm not leaning it one way or another. And I'll try again. Better on the consistency. I might have done too much pressure and gone a little too deep. So as you're making these, as you're tooling, you should be thinking in your mind that same thing. So my pressure was better. I was even on both sides, but I probably did it a little too hard and did too deep. So I'm going to try to correct that with the next one I do, and I'm really happy with this impression. It's pretty good. It's just about right. So now I'm going to try to make all the rest of them match that one so that I have some consistency in my pattern. That one was maybe a little light. See if I could fit. There we go. And so that's decent. Consistency, right? Okay. Let's do the background tool next. So this one is pretty hard to see. This is the small one. Looks kind of similar to the pear shader, but a lot smaller. This one and the next tool that we are going to use, the smaller the surface of a tool, the lot easier it is to get a good impression, meaning that I don't have to hit it quite as hard for it to go as deep into the leather, because the surface of the tool is a lot smaller. So keep that in mind because it's really easy to hit your tool too hard and go too deep. And if you're on thin leather, that it will go all the way through and ruin your project. So keep that in mind, and you'll probably have noticed that you don't have to hit this one quite as hard to get the same impression as some of these tools above. So this one is called the background tool. Go ahead, remember our goal is to make consistent and even impressions. This is just our scrap piece of leather. The only thing we're doing is just learning how. So if you need to practice hitting harder and hitting lighter and hitting to find that regular, go ahead. You'll be able to tell the difference. Harder, lighter, about right. You can see the difference in those three right there. Okay. So after you have your row of background using the background tool, We have one more tool. It has the small circle on it. It's called a cedar tool. And this is another one. As you can imagine, you don't have to hit it as hard to get the same good impression as some of our other tools. And you can hear the difference even in mine. Well, at least I think you can hear the difference on your video. The difference between when I hit this tool there we go, and when I hit this tool. So it takes a lot less pressure. So go ahead with your cedar tool. This one is the one that gives a lot of people trouble because you don't have to hit it very hard. And so I find that kids have a harder time getting their impressions to be consistent because they naturally want to hit it as hard as they do some of the other tools. And you don't have to. So it's a lot of practicing, getting to know each tool. Whenever you get to working on our projects for the fair, if you need to keep a scrap piece of leather like this wet next to you so that you can practice doing a few impressions first, so that you know what that strength is for each tool, then by all means keep something like this handy. Okay, so there's our basic introduction to our 5 basic stamping tools. If you would like to go ahead and continue learning how to stamp, if you filled up your whole thing, then you should have a second piece of scrap leather in there. And if you feel like you're ready to go ahead and start on a project, then tune in with me to our next video. Thanks.